Boop. All right. All right. Great day to you. Great day to you, beautiful people. I hope you're doing well, staying safe, and being okay. Black man, I hope you're protecting your mental, finding time for an emotional release valve, and continuing to strive to become beneficial. It is Tuesday. So happy Tuesday to you all. Um, Fall is falling still. It's nice out. The leaves are, trees are starting to get a little bit more naked, which is fine. And the weather is, at least here in the DMV, is still doing this little fluctuating thing. But I think with fall and spring, our seasons, those two seasons, you never know what you're going to get. Like it could be really nice, whether it's fall or spring, or it could be extreme hot or cold. You don't know, but it's still nice. So grateful for another day. Excited to continue our reading. Welcome to Reading with Jam. I'm Jamal Calpin. An actor, content creator, and just a guy wanting to help other men overcome great mediocrity, so that we can be and become our best selves for glory and for good. Um, yeah, because I think that's important as part of our design as men here on earth in this earthly experience. But we are reading here with Reading with Jam, at least on the Beneficial Black Man YouTube channel, and here on my Instagram page for right now. We're reading personal development content to help us with our mental health and our emotional intelligence, and so that we can continue to grow as people and as men. Eventually, I do want to start reading some fiction work because I like fiction. I like telling stories and doing character voices and stuff like that. And that's something that I want to continue to improve in. But yeah, here with Reading with Jam, I'm practicing my narrating as a voice actor, as an actor, but I'm also learning, and I'm also learning with you all. At least that's the plan. So yes, we have been reading Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, and we are continuing that reading today. This is we're going to be reading chapter 6. Chapter 6 of the book, entitled, chapter 6 is entitled Places We Go When We're Hurting. Oh man, this one might be this one might be heavy. But we got the time on the clock, 30 minutes on the clock. We're going to start reading, and if there's time, I'm going to do, share some of my thoughts. But let's get into it. 30 minutes on the clock. Let's go. Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. Chapter 6. Places we go when we're hurting. Anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, grief. Anguish. It's one of those words you understand the meaning of just by the way it sounds. It has this gnarling rasp to it as you twist your mouth around to say it. Kind of like what feeling it does to your insides. It's an awful, drawn out, knotted up word. It's also one of the things I feel without you. Oh, Renata Suzuki. Poets, artists, and writers approach the topic of anguish without apology, often capturing it in a way that leaves us with a sense of shock, heartbreak, and foreboding. We may not be clear on what we're seeing or reading or hearing, but we are certain that we don't want to move in closer. We don't want to know or relive that emotion, that experience. Sorry, you two people, moving my microphone. The painting by August Friedrich Albrecht Schneck. Oh, is that his one name? August Friedrich Albrecht Schneck hangs in the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. While little is known about its artist, it has twice been voted one of the NGV's most popular works. First in 1906, and then again a century later in 2011. The pained mother surrounded by a murder of crows is hard to take in. Oh, oh, okay. So this is the picture, if you can see it. On the other end of the art and science spectrum, social science researchers seem to steer clear of the concept of anguish altogether. Many study around the construct, while others put it on a continuum that includes less extreme emotions like sadness. Yet, what emerged from my work is that anguish is an emotion and an experience that is singular and must be understood and named, especially for those of us who have experienced it, while experience it, will experience it, or may bear witness to it. Anguish is an almost unbearable and traumatic swirl of shock, incredulity, incredul. Guys, I gotta, all right, I gotta practice before I start reading in the morning. But anyways, incredulity, grief, and powerlessness. Shock and incredulity. That can't be how you say that word. Incred, whatever. We'll stick with it. Shock and incredulity can take our breath away, and grief and powerlessness often come from our hearts and our minds. But anguish, the combination of these experiences, not only takes away our ability to breathe, feel, and think, it comes for our bones. Anguish often causes us to physically crumble in on ourselves, literally bringing us to our knees or forcing us all the way to the ground. The element of powerlessness is what makes anguish traumatic. We are unable to change, reverse, or negotiate what has happened. And even in those situations where we can temporarily reroute anguish with to do lists and tasks, it finds its way back to us. About 10 years ago, I received a call from someone I love very much. In the span of 90 seconds, they shared that they had spent the night contemplating suicide, then disclosed a major self deletion, then disclosed a major trauma that I did not know about, a violence that tore through my memories and reorganized my history and my life. I was standing on a sidewalk outside my church when I took the call. The kids had run inside to find friends, and Steve was a few feet in front of me, watching me after I said, I wonder why this person is calling so early on a Sunday. I better answer it. As I listened, I dropped my purse so I could brace myself against the wall, clenching my cell phone in the other hand and sliding down the brick wall. Pure anguish. After helping me stagger to the car, Steve got the kids from inside the church and drove me home. For months, it was a dance of desperate attempts to fix, change, and help, followed by more anguish. Then ultimately, I got help. Today, a decade later, I no longer fall to the ground when I think about that call, but it still evokes anguish, and I am not the same. I'm still me at my core, but it took time and help in processing for the bones to come back, and they're slightly different than they were before. Another example comes from a story that a graduate student named Gabriella shared with me several years ago when we were talking about my research in the experience of anguish. Sorry, just checking other things. Okay. Gabby told the story of being in high school and spending the weekend helping her best friend, Carmen, prepare for her quinceañera. Quinceañera is a coming of age celebration in many Latin communities. It's a special milestone for girls who are turning 15, quince in Spanish. The celebration often starts with a religious service followed by a party. These gatherings range from small get togethers in the girls' home to huge parties in hotel ballrooms. Sometimes there are even courts, which are similar to bridal parties. Gabby and Carmen had been best friends since middle school, and Gabby wanted to be by Carmen's side for what she knew would be an emotional weekend. Carmen's mother had died of ovarian cancer when Carmen was 12. Gabby told me that she was pretty sure that if it had been up to Carmen, she would have skipped the quinceanera, but Carmen's family insisted. The night before the celebration, Carmen and Gabby were in Carmen's room, sitting on the bed texting with friends. They heard a quiet knock on the door. It was Carmen's dad, accompanied by her older brother and her older sister. Gabby could tell by the look on their faces that something serious was happening. Carmen's father stopped at the door, and her brother and sister gently pushed past him until they were standing just inside the room. Carmen stood up and looked at her father, who had one foot in her room and one foot in the hall. He, excuse me, he looked unsure, and this made Carmen visibly nervous. What is it, Papa? She asked. Her father, eyes cast down and hands slightly trembling, handed Carmen a wooden box. Carmen held the box, nervously looking at her father and her siblings. His sister said, Open it, Carmen. It's okay. Carmen gave Gabby a knowing look and then opened the box. In it was the tiara that her mother and her sister had worn at their quinceañeras. Both Carmen and Gabby had been expecting this moment, and they both felt relieved that it had arrived and would soon be past. They had even talked through what to say and how to act with Carmen's father, who Carmen guessed would be in tears. But then, unexpectedly, Carmen's father handed Carmen an envelope. Carmen's father could barely speak. Your mother wrote you this note the week before she died. She wanted you to open it the day before your quinceanera. Carmen grabbed the letter and immediately fell to the floor. Gabby said she just sank and moaned. It was like she was being hurt and sucked into the ground. Before Gabby could understand what was happening, Carmen's brother and her sister had both dropped to their knees and were also on the floor, crying and burying their heads in their hands. Carmen's father held onto the door frame for a minute, but ended up on the floor with his children. Gabby and I talked about how what we think is a familiar grief, a grief we've come to know and understand and even integrate into our lives, can surprise us again and again, often in the form of anguish. This is especially true when something sparks shock and incredulity. Incredulity. I hate this word right now. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Incredulity. 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 Okay, whatever. Shock and incredulity in us, like the letter that Carmen's mother had written to her. It's often hard to find our way back into our bodies after experiencing anguish. This is why so much effective trauma work today is not only about reclaiming our breath, our feelings, and our thinking, but also getting our bones back and returning to our bodies. That's deep. When we experience anguish and we don't get help or support, we can find it difficult to get up off the floor and re engage with our lives. We go through the motions, but we are still crumbled. I tried doing that for several months until I realized that I needed to talk with someone to help process that phone call and my anguish. There is another alternative to not addressing the trauma of anguish. We can convince ourselves that we're okay and keep ourselves upright by hanging our crumbling anguish on rigidity and perfectionism in silence, like a wet towel hanging on a rod. We can become closed off, never open to vulnerability and its gifts, and barely existing because anything at any moment could threaten that fragile, rigid scaffolding that's holding up our crumbling selves and keeping us standing. The human spirit is resilient, and just as we can reclaim our ability to breathe and feel and think, we can rebuild the bones that anguish rips away. But it takes help and time. I don't remember when or where I first saw dark elegy, but I knew that I'd never forget it, and I haven't. When I started working on this book, I reached out to the artist and asked if I could share her work as an example of anguish. She generously said yes. A note from Susie Ellen Lowenstein. On December 21st, 1988, while coming home for the holidays, our older son Alexander was deleted along with 258 others aboard Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. A total of 270 people lost their lives in that terrorist attack, 259 aboard the jumbo jet and 11 on the ground. Alexander was 21 years young. Dark elegy is made up of 75 larger than life size pieces, each portraying a mother or wife at that moment when they first heard the awful news of the passing of their loved one. What makes this memorial so unique, even more so than the sheer number of pieces or the personal and individual loss each mother portrays, is the fact that it was created by one of those affected rather than by an outsider portraying someone else's tragedy. I am one of the depicted figures. Although the concept of my sculpture, Dark Elegy, was spawned out of this, my personal tragedy, it has always been dedicated to all victims of terrorism. Dark Elegy is a universal appeal for peace and dignity for all victims of senseless hate and vengeance called terrorism, and will be a beacon for all peace loving people. All right. Okay. Sorry. This chapter is kind of heavy. Okay. Hope, hopelessness, and despair. We need hope like we need air. To live without hope is to risk suffocating on hopelessness and despair, risk being crushed by the belief that there is no way out of what is holding us back, no way to get to what we desperately need. But hope is not what most of us think it is. It's not a warm, fuzzy emotion that fills us with a sense of possibility. Hope is a way of thinking, a cognitive process. Yes, emotions play a role, but hope is made up of what researcher C.R. Snyder called a trilogy of goals, pathways, and agency. We experience hope when One, we have the ability to set realistic goals. I know where I want to go. Two, we are able to figure out how to achieve those goals, including the ability to stay flexible and develop alternative pathways. I know how to get there, I'm persistent, and I can tolerate disappointment and try new paths again and again. And three, we have agency. We believe in ourselves. I can do this. Oh, wow. Um, let's see. I don't know if y'all are going to be able to see this good. Maybe not. But this is the picture of the dark elegy. I guess you can Google it and find it, but it's kind of rough. I mean, it's beautiful. Okay, hold on. Dark Elegy, sculptures by Susie Ellen Lowenstein. So check that out. Google it. Okay, there's a quote here that says, "Hope is a function of struggle. We develop hope not during the easy or comfortable times, but through adversity and discomfort." Oof, it's camera lighting. All right. Sorry. Hope is a function of struggle. We develop hope not during the easy or comfortable times, but through adversity and discomfort. Hope is forged when our goals, pathways, and agency are tested and when change is actually possible. Unfortunately, there are times when hope isn't sufficient to combat entrenched systemic barriers. It doesn't matter how much hope we have if the deck is stacked or the rules apply to some but not others. That is actually a recipe for hopelessness and despair. We think we should be able to overcome an obstacle. However, the system is rigged, so there is no possible positive outcome. It's also important to know that hope is learned. According to Snyder, children most often learn the habit of hope from their parents. To learn hopefulness, children need relationships that are characterized by boundaries, consistency, and support. Children with high levels of hopefulness have experience with adversity. They've been given the opportunity to struggle, and in doing that, they learn how to believe in themselves and their abilities. As someone who struggles watching my kids struggle, I can tell you, this is hard. I remind myself of the saying, prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child. One thing that bolsters my commitment to letting my kids figure out on their own things that are both, wait, sorry. One thing that bolsters my commitment to letting my kids figure out on their own things that are both developmentally appropriate and possible is thinking about the alternatives, hopelessness and despair. Hopelessness and despair. Everything about these words is hard. First, they are both emotions and experiences that can lead to feelings of desperation and can pose serious threats to our well being. Second, it is really difficult to separate these two constructs and talk about them as different experiences, yet they are. In the despair research, the word hopeless is often used synonymously with despair, but in the research on hopelessness, we see very few mentions of the concept of despair. Let's break it down. While hope is not an emotion, hopelessness and despair are emotions. Hopelessness arises out of a combination of negative life events and negative thought patterns, particularly self blame and the perceived inability to change our circumstances. Let's look back at C.R. Snyder's work and reverse his trilogy of goals, pathways, and agency to better understand hopelessness. Hopelessness stems from not being able to set realistic goals. We don't know what we want. And even if we can identify realistic goals, we can't figure out how to achieve them. If we attempt to achieve the goals, we give up when we fail. We can't tolerate disappointment, and we can't reset. Last, we don't believe in ourselves or our ability to achieve what we want. Hopelessness is serious. In more than 30 years of research, Aaron Beck and his colleagues have established that experiences of hopelessness are strongly and specifically related to self deletion. Or, you know, there are two ways to think about despair and its relationship to hopelessness. Hopelessness can apply to a specific situation, such as feeling hopeless about finishing school or feeling hopeless about our financial future, or to life more generally. Despair is a sense of hopelessness about a person's entire life and future. When extreme hopelessness seeps into all the corners of our lives and combines with extreme sadness, we feel despair. I once heard theologian Rob Bell define despair as the belief that tomorrow will be just like today. When we are in struggle and or experiencing pain, despair, that belief that there is no end to what we're experiencing, is a desperate and claustrophobic feeling. We can't figure a way out of we can't figure a way out of or through the struggle and the suffering. When I look at examples of hope practices in our research, I see commitments to new ways of thinking about what we want to achieve and why. We need to learn how to reality check our goals and the pathways to them, and how to take the shame out of having to start over many, many times when our first plan fails. I used to ask my graduate students to submit a semester long goal the second week of school. After doing this for years, I knew I could expect 90% of the goals to be unrealistic. Setting realistic goals is a skill and a prerequisite for hope. When we don't have these skills, small disappointments can grow into hopelessness and despair. If we didn't learn hope from our parents, we can still learn it as adults, but it's going to require skilled help and support, a therapist or maybe even a coach. We all fear pain and struggle, but they are often necessary for growth. And more important, they don't present the level of danger that hopelessness and despair bring to us. We can't ignore hopelessness and despair in ourselves or others. They are both reliable predictors of self deleting thoughts, self deleting attempts, and completed self deletion, especially when hopelessness is accompanied by emotional pain. In addition to cultivating a hope practice, getting intentional, getting intentional about setting goals, thinking through pathways, and developing a strong belief in ourselves and what we can accomplish, we can also look to Martin. Hold on, I'm sorry, I'm going to read this sentence again. In addition to cultivating a hope practice being getting intentional about setting goals, thinking through pathways, and developing a strong belief in ourselves and what we can accomplish, we can also look to Martin Seligman, Seligman's research on resilience, especially what many people call his three P's: personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. Personalization. When we experience despair and hopelessness, we often believe that we are the problem and forget to think about larger issues and context. Self blame and criticism don't lead to increased hopefulness, they're quicksand. Excuse me. Realizing that outside factors play a role in our struggles can give us a different lens on our experience. Permanence. This one is tough because thinking that our struggle will never end is built into the experiences of despair and hopelessness. This is the tomorrow will be no different from today thinking. One way to build resilience is to practice thinking about the temporary nature of most setbacks as a part of how we look at adversity on a daily basis. We can't afford to wait to build this skill until we're up against something huge in our lives. Permanence can be tough for me, so I've developed the habit of asking myself, I'm really scared, worried, overwhelmed, stressed about what's happening. Will this issue be a big deal in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? I've been doing it for about a year. I started it during the pandemic, and now I try not to sink into fear until I've asked and answered these questions. If nothing else, it pulls my thinking brain online instead of letting my fear brain run the show. And pervasiveness. Sometimes, when we're struggling, we fall into the trap of believing that whatever we're up against has stained or changed every single thing in our life. Nothing good is left. I recently found myself dealing with a crisis at work that, for a moment, felt like the end of the world. I felt as if this thing had swallowed me whole and nothing was left. Then I got a text that said, "Hey mom, do you know where my do you know where my goggles are?" The first thing I thought was, the three P's. There's a part of my life, the biggest, most important part, that hasn't even been touched by this. My second thought was, I needed to apologize to my mom for walking past my stack of shit on the bottom of the stairs every day for 17 years. Those goggles have been on the stairs for a week. Let's see. Sadness. Okay. Sorry. I have comments for this chapter. Okay. Sadness. As I was writing this book, I posted a question on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter to all of the folks in our social media community. What is your favorite sad movie? At last, count at last count, we'd received more than 100,000 enthusiastic responses. The films that came up over and over included, in no particular order, Life is Beautiful, Terms of Endearment, Beaches, The Joy Luck Club, The Color Purple, Still Magnolias, Brokeback Mountain, P.S. I Love You, Inside Out, Up, every movie ever made where a dog dies. I'm sorry. I don't mean to laugh. I can't even type this list without getting a lump in my throat. I've seen lots of these. In fact, I've seen most of the ones that people mention, except for the ones where dogs die. I was caught off guard in fourth grade with Where the Red Fern Grows and Old Yeller, both in the same year. That won't happen again. Not only was I curious about the films, I became obsessed with analyzing the descriptors and the reasons that people loved their films. Beautifully devastating, so relatable, what it means to be human. I bawl every time I see this, but it's also an incredibly joyful film. It's been different movies depending on the season of my life. I felt less alone. If I need to release some tears, when I need a good cry. I don't really like the sadness, but I'm so affected by this movie. This film is the best in people and the worst. I'm not going to tell you that sadness is wonderful and we need it. I'm going to say that sadness is important and we need it. Feeling sad is a normal response to loss or defeat, or even the perception of loss or defeat. To be human is to know sadness. Owning our sadness is courageous and a necessary step in finding our way back to ourselves and each other. Here are four things that I think are important to know about sadness. Number one, sadness and depression are not the same thing. Sadness is something referred to as depressed mood. However, sadness is a common but not essential feature of clinical depression. Technically, depression is a cluster of symptoms that persist over a period of time. These symptoms can include lack of interest in pleasant activities, loss of appetite, excessive fatigue and/or insomnia, and difficulty concentrating. Number two, sadness and grief are not the same thing. Although sadness is one part of grief, grief involves a whole group of emotions and experiences. I'll tell you more about grief soon. And number three, there are positive aspects to sadness. Joseph P. Forgas, a professor of psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, writes, though much has been made of the many benefits of happiness, it's important to consider that sadness can be beneficial too. Sad people are less prone to judgmental errors, are more resistant to eyewitness distortions, are sometimes more motivated, and are more sensitive to social norms. They can act with more generosity too. Forgas goes on to explain evolutionary theory suggests that we should embrace all of our emotions, as each has an important role to play under the right circumstances. So, though you may seek ways to increase happiness, don't haphazardly push away your sadness. No doubt, no doubt is there a no doubt is there it's there for good reason. Additionally, some scholars have speculated that one function of sadness is to cause the person to evaluate their life and consider making changes in their circumstances following a negative event, as well as to recruit help and support from others. My research has taught me that acknowledging and naming our own sadness is critical in the formation of compassion and empathy. In our saddest moments, we want to be held by or feel connected to someone who has known that same ache, even if what caused it is completely different. We don't want our sadness overlooked or diminished by someone who can't tolerate what we're feeling because they're unwilling or unable to own their own sadness. Sorry, I'm checking. Okay. And number four, there's a reason we love sad movies. Researchers Julian Honeck and colleagues investigate the sad film paradox. How can a negative emotion, such as sadness, go together with aesthetic liking and even pleasure? Their findings totally align with the 100,000 plus comments from our community. We like to be moved. We like to feel connected to what it means to be human, to be reminded of our inextricable connection to one another. Sadness moves the Sadness moves the individual us toward the collective us. Their study revealed a highly significant positive correlation between sadness and enjoyment. However, this association is sequential. Sadness leads to feeling moved, which in turn leads to enjoyment. Hence, sadness primarily functions as a contributor to and intensifier of the emotional state of being moved. Look back at that list of movies. They were moving. I felt deeply moved by them. Grief. Grief does not obey your plans or your wishes. Grief will do whatever it wants to you, whenever it wants to. In that regard, grief has a lot in common with love. Elizabeth Gilbert. Grief is often thought of as a process that includes many emotions, rather than a singular emotion. For a long time, we thought about the grief process in terms of linear stages, but almost all of the recent research actually refutes the idea that grief progresses in predictable, sequenced stages. Robert A. Niemeyer, a psychology professor at the University of Memphis and a clinician, is one of the world's most prolific grief researchers. I often share his work with professionals looking for training in grief work and with individuals who are grieving. Niemeyer writes, a central process in grieving is the attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. In my research, three foundational elements of grief emerge from the data: loss, longing, and feeling lost. Excuse me. Loss. While death and separation are tangible losses associated with grief, some of the participants describe loss that are more difficult to identify or describe. These included the loss of normality, the loss of what could be, and the loss of what we thought we knew or understood about something or someone. Longing. Related to loss is longing. Longing is not conscious wanting. It's an involuntary yearning for wholeness, for understanding, for meaning, for the opportunity to regain or even simply touch what we've lost. Longing is a vital and important part of grief, yet many of us feel we need to keep our longings to ourselves for fear we will be misunderstood, perceived as engaging in magical or unrealistic thinking, or lacking in fortitude and resilience. In feeling lost, grief requires us to reorient every part of our physical, emotional, and social worlds. When we imagine the need to do this, most of us picture the painful struggle to adjust to a tangible change, such as someone dying or moving away. But this is a very limited view of grief. The more difficult it is for us to articulate our experiences of loss, longing, and feeling lost to the people around us, the more disconnected and alone we feel. Talking about grief is difficult in a world that wants us to get over it, or a community that is quick to pathologize grief. The Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia is another tremendous resource. Their definitions below are very helpful when thinking about grief. I think the most important line is when a person adapts to a loss, grief, sorry, when a person adapts to a loss, grief is not over. It doesn't mean that we're sad the rest of our lives. It means that grief finds a place in our lives. Imagine a world in which we honor that place in ourselves and others rather than hiding it, ignoring it, or pretending it doesn't exist because of fear or shame. I keep thinking back to a conversation I had on Unlocking Us with the grief expert David Kessler. I'll never forget him saying this. Each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint, but what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. Professor Niemeyer's work supports this need for real connection in healing. He writes, most people who struggle with complicating loss feel a great press to tell the story, to find someone willing to hear what others cannot. and who can join them in making sense of the death without withdrawing into awkward silence or offering trite and superficial advice regarding the questions it poses. This need for connection, for storytelling and story catching, is what okay, excuse me, is what makes group therapy and support groups such powerful healing experiences for those who are grieving. That's an interesting phrase, story catching. I don't think I've ever heard that before. Working through complicated grief, however, requires a mental health professional with training in complicated grief work. Okay. Okay. So this is pretty much the end of the chapter, but they have these definitions of different aspects of grief. So I'm going to read these real quick. So the Center for Complicated Grief. Acute grief occurs in the initial period after a loss. It almost always includes strong feelings of yearning, longing, and sadness, along with anxiety, bitterness, anger, remorse, guilt, and or shame. Thoughts are mostly focused on the person who died, and it can be difficult to concentrate on anything else. Acute grief dominates a person's life. Integrated grief is the result of adaptation to the loss. When a person adapts to a loss, grief is not over. Instead, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to their loss are integrated in ways that allow them to remember and honor the person who died. Grief finds a place in their life. Complicated grief occurs when something interferes with adaptation. When this happens, acute grief can persist for very long periods of time. A person with complicated grief feels intense emotional pain. They can't stop feeling that their loved one might somehow reappear, and they don't see a pathway forward. A future without their loved one seems forever dismal and unappealing. Grief dominates their thoughts and feelings with no respite in sight. Relationships with family and friends flounder. Life can seem purposeless, as if nothing matters without their loved one. Others begin to feel frustrated, helpless, and discouraged. Even professionals may be uncertain about how to help. People often think this is depression, but complicated grief and depression are not the same thing. And then, based on the research of Tashel Bordier, disenfranchised grief is a less studied form of grief. Grief that is not openly acknowledged or publicly supported through mourning practices or rituals because the experience is not valued or counted by others as a loss. The grief can also be invisible or hard to see by others. Examples of disenfranchised grief include loss of a partner or parent due to divorce, loss of an unborn child, and or infertility. The multitude of losses experienced by a survivor of SA, um, and loss of a loved one to self deletion. As an illustrative example of disenfranchised grief, Tasha Border explains that SA survivors suffer from numerous losses, many of which are invisible to others. Some of these losses include loss of one's prior worldview, loss of trust, loss of self identity and self esteem, loss of freedom and independence, loss of a sense of safety and security, and loss of sexual interest. I think that word is okay to say. Okay, so good morning. The chapter 6 is heavy. And I low key apologize for that. I know it's early, but I think this was a very important chapter. Again, we read chapter 6 of Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, and it's places we go when we're hurting. And so we covered anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, and grief. There is a lot there. there is a lot there. And I think so in the list, she mentioned that she asked her community for sad movies that they enjoy or that they like. And one of the movies they mentioned was Inside Out. And I feel like I want to sit down and watch that movie again. But I think there are probably a lot of us, if you haven't seen the movie, there's a lot of the characters are based off of different emotions. And one of the characters is I think Joy or happiness or something like that. I think her name is Joy. But then there's a sadness character, right? And Joy is really focused on Okay, sorry. Inside Out, it focuses on these various emotions that this young girl is having and this big change that's happening in her life because I think they're moving, and she's growing up and all this stuff. And so there's joy, envy, I think like fear, anger, and sadness. And there might be another one that I can't remember. But joy is really she really likes to run the show. She really wants the girl. I can't remember the girl's name, but they're she's really focused on making sure that the girl is experiencing joy and happiness and being happy or whatever. But then there's a sadness character that it seems to be more recently that she's having bigger impact and effect on this girl. And joy is like, I don't like you, sadness. I don't want you to be here. Stop making the girl sad. We don't really need you. All we need more is joy, 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 and joy. But even in this book, it talks about the importance of sadness. It talks about the importance of experiencing these things and how it makes us human. And I would say for a very long time, I've been more in the joy camp, uh, wanting to only experience happy things and never really wanting to deal with the complexities and the deeper experiences of sadness, of anguish, of despair, of hopelessness, of grief, of mourning, all of those things. But neglecting that and hiding from that and running from that is to hide from your humanity, is to run from your humanity and to not embrace these experiences, although I'm sure it's very confusing at times, to embrace these experiences that the Most High has given us and has made room for us to experience. I'm sure a lot of us would rather just be happy all the time, to have joy all the time. But there's beauty and benefit in that. And I think about myself as a child, and I want to do a separate video on this, but as a child, if I had the option, if I had the option to watch cartoons on TV more than anything else, I would. Um, Instead of watching, stuff that was out or popular at the time. The way I described them was like human shows. So, which in itself, damn, that's deep in saying that. But stuff like Fresh Prince, Martin, Family Matters, stuff like that. I would sitcoms or maybe dramas and stuff like that. I would avoid as much as possible as a child. Like I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch anime, I'm going to watch Looney Tunes, I'm going to watch cartoons as much as possible. And looking back in hindsight, I regret doing that. I regret doing that. But of course, as a child, like you're not thinking of the complexities of like your emotional growth and your mental health and stuff like that. But I think for a lot of us, we don't want to experience negativity. We don't want to experience bad things in our life. We don't want to experience the loss of family members. We don't want to experience breakups. We don't want to experience the loss of a job. We don't want to experience this stuff. But there's a reason behind it. And there is, like she mentioned in the book, it's a space where we can grow when we navigate and work through those things. And I think even in the past few years, after 2020, including 2020, I feel like the whole world has been forced to embrace and experience these intense feelings. Lots of grief, lots of sadness, lots of mourning, lots of anguish, lots of hopelessness, lots of pain. And it's heavy, but in that, it does forces us to pause. It forces us to reflect. It forces us to question things. It forces us to have to work through stuff. And hopefully, we don't work through them alone. Hopefully, we do get therapy. Hopefully, we do reach out to friends, loved ones, and we try to work through it. Because I don't think, again, part of our humanity, we're never supposed to work through things alone. We are designed to be communal. We're designed to be interdependent and designed to work together as people, even going through emotional experiences, whether they're highs or lows. It's awesome to be able to celebrate joyous experiences with other people. And it's also beneficial to go through hard things with other people, to support you, to give you advice, to just be there. But I'll say for myself, I know that's something that I have avoided, kind of like the previous chapter, chapter 5, where we're discussing like where do you go when things aren't very clear or things are messy and stuff like that. But both of these chapters, I think, I don't know if she did it on purpose, but both of these chapters are very, at least to me, very crucial and heavy. Um, but they're important. They're important. So, I mean, those are my thoughts. Again, we're reading Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. We finished chapter 6 today, Places We Go When We're Hurting. Tomorrow, we will jump into chapter 7, which is Places We Go with Others. Yeah. So thank you all for those who have tuned in on YouTube and on Instagram. I appreciate you. Thank you. If you want to look up my YouTube stuff, go to the Beneficial Black Man channel. If you want to follow me on Instagram, it's Jamal Calpin. Thank you for joining me with another Reading with Jam. I'm Jamal Calpin, and I will talk to y'all later. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Peace.